The following is a News 7 Black History Special, Black Slaves, Red Masters. Hello everyone, I'm Sam Ford. Earlier this month in our 7 Inside Reports, I took a personal journey to look at a largely unknown chapter of black history when my ancestors and thousands of other blacks were slaves, not of the whites, but of the Indians. Well, a lot of people responded who'd missed some of the segments and who wanted to know more about the subject. So today you'll see it all and more, and get your pencils. At the end we'll have not a test, but an address and phone number where you can get more information. Every summer at Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the Cherokee Indians sponsor their Trail of Tears pageant, the story of how the U.S. government robbed the so-called 5 civilized tribes of their homelands in the South and moved them by force to Oklahoma. They don't tell about the thousands of blacks the tribes brought with them, their slaves.
My mammy and pappy belonged to a part Cherokee named W.P. Thompson when I was born.
The woman reading is my sister, Elaine Ford Staton, but the words are those of our great-grandmother, Phyllis Thompson Pettit, whose Georgia-born parents were brought by the Cherokees over the trail. Johnson Thompson was Phyllis's brother.
Before that, Pappy had been owned by 3 different masters. One was the rich Joe Vann, who lived down at Weber's Fall, and another was Chief Lowry of the Cherokees.
My cousin, Maurice Shepard, reading the words of his great-grandfather. The interviews were conducted 52 years ago here at Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, when both my great-grandmother, Phyllis Pettit, and her brother, Johnson Thompson, were in their 80s, part of a federal writers project. Now, both of them are buried in this cemetery. But after I read their words, I was set on a mission to find out how my family became slaves of the Indians. I learned that beginning with the administration of George Washington, it was the policy of the U.S. government to civilize the Indians by teaching them modern farming techniques.
To adopt agricultural practices that patterned after the whites, and one of those in the South was slave trade.
What are you most eager to learn about your family?
I don't know, everything. All of the little stories are amazing, are fascinating.
Actor Don Cheadle has never heard anything about his ancestors who lived through the aftermath of slavery. So we searched for clues about his father's side of the family. The paper trail that we uncovered confounded our expectations. Unlike most African Americans who were freed by the end of the Civil War, your ancestors weren't.
They couldn't get it right. Well, they just stuck to it.
Well, take a look at this.
Chickasaw Nation Freedmen Roll.
This document is an official enrollment card for the Chickasaw Freedmen, the former slaves owned by the Chickasaw Nation.
Owned by the Chickasaw Nation?
Owned by the Chickasaw Nation. Your ancestors were enslaved by Native Americans. Here's your great-great-grandmother, Mary Kemp, her 11 children, including Bill Cheadle, your great-grandfather, William. And you can see William's father, Henderson, or Hence Cheadle. You are one of the few African Americans who was not enslaved by white people, enslaved by Native Americans.
I don't know how I feel about that. It's crazy because
most people don't realize that the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations owned slaves. As self-governing entities, they weren't subject to the laws of the United States. So what did this mean for Don Cheadle's ancestors? When the Civil War ended, the 5 civilized tribes kept their slaves. They refused to liberate their slaves.
everybody wanted to roll with the slavery thing as long as they could.
That's right. They said, come and get them.
Yeah, you got to take my slave.
You got, yeah.
Pry it from my cold, dead hand.
And I had no idea.
I had neither. This is amazing.
The United States government didn't make a treaty with the Chickasaw until 1866, forcing them to liberate their slaves and make them citizens. The Chickasaws freed their slaves, but they did not offer them citizenship in the Chickasaw Nation.
These honorary white people? I mean, what's going on here?
Don Your ancestors were in Indian territory, yet they were neither Chickasaw nor were they Americans. They were a people without a country and without any legal status at all.
That's crazy.
The Chickasaw freedmen would spend decades in this stateless limbo, invisible and forgotten.
Situation out here. By 1750, black folk peaked out. The population of blacks in America got up to 34%. And then the white society got very scared with that. They said, with that kind of number in this country, there's a possibility that blacks might get together with Indians. So then in every treaty that whites were signing with Indian treaties, they put an incentive in there for the Indians to turn against black folk. They say, every time you catch a black, you're going to turn him in. And they would pay an Indian $20 on average to chase down an escaped runaway slave, to track him in the woods and bring him back to his plantation. And because of that, Indians in America allied with the white dominant society. And I keep hearing blacks bragging about the fact how much Indian blood they got. Indians were not your friends in history. They were not your friends. And I don't mean to put the Indians down. Indians got special problems. I'm not putting anybody else down. I'm not going to put the Hispanics down. I'm going to tell you the truth. And out of the 5 civilized tribes, in the United States, all five of them sided with the South to keep slavery. In a 20-year period between 1840 and 1860, the biggest killers of blacks in America were Indians. And see, the Indians then, so that's what they were trying to get, that kind of an ally between whites and Indians, so that blacks could not ally with them. And that's why every civilized tribe was a slave trader. Indian tribe was a slave trader and a slave owner. As a matter of fact, in Camp Smith, right not too far from me in Texas, in 1867, in Camp Smith, the Choctaws and Chickasaws still had slaves even 2 years after the war. They wouldn't turn them loose. And the United States government gave them $300,000 to turn black slaves loose, to the Chickasaw and Choctaw Indians, and said, we'll give you $300,000 and take this money and divide it up and turn those black slaves loose and give them some land. And they never, by 2 years later, in 1869, blacks were coming to Washington saying the Indians never gave them anything. And to this day, blacks never got a penny from the Indians. So what I'm saying is everybody has been against blacks because we've never been united. But so when I leave here after today, I want you all to be together, okay?
In order to get where you're going, you need to know where you came from.
Verdi Triplett is a Chickasaw freedman and Choctaw by blood, but you won't find his name on any citizenship roll. The only official link to Triplett's American Indian heritage is a footnote on his ancestors' freedman roll card, which states separated from Silas Darnell, a Choctaw Indian. Typically, if the mother was a black former slave and the father was American Indian, the father section would have just been left blank.
I could look at my grandmother, who was the blood Indian, and I could see that she didn't look black. You know, I said, wait a minute, now something is not right. I said, you do not look like a black woman. But we never did ask any questions, and they didn't tell us anything.
He says the closer the conversation got to slavery, the less people said. In his book, Black Indians, A Hidden Heritage, historian William Loren Katz writes turning Africans and Native Americans against each other was essential for the slave system to succeed in America, a practice that dates back to the British colonists. They kept the pot of animosity boiling, Katz wrote. Whites turned Indians into slave hunters and slave owners, and Africans into Indian fighters. Light-skinned Africans were pitted against dark-skinned, free against enslaved, black Indians against pure Africans or pure Indians. The federal government encouraged American Indians to embrace the institution of chattel slavery, enslaving and owning humans and their offspring as property to help civilize them. And traders traveled and pushed slavery to the tribes as much as the goods they were hustling.
All these years, I thought that my family had been enslaved by white Americans. But it was shocking to me to realize that they had been enslaved by Chickasaw Indians and Choctaws. And that had a devastating effect on me.
Triplett tells VNN his research has been a roller coaster of emotions, particularly when it led him to a shocking personal discovery.
My dad was a self-employed farmer, and he used to haul hay for different people, cut and rake and bale hay for different people. And as a kid, 10 years old, I would be helping him. And he would do contracts with the people that owned the John Ring plantation in the 60s. And I would be on that land working and didn't realize that I was working on the same land that my great-great-grandfather was a slave on.
Overall, Triplett says uncovering this history and sharing it with others has been fulfilling for his life. He and other freedmen continue to seek full citizenship with the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Muskogee Creek nations. The Cherokee Nation accepted their freedmen as full citizens in 2017 following a lengthy court battle. Triplett describes the situation as apartheid on American soil.
What I really don't like is the fact that my federal tax dollars go to them every year. So in essence, I am paying them to discriminate against me. And I don't think that's right.
For VNN, I'm Brittany Harlow.
By 1830, through wars and treaties, the 5 tribes had lost most of it. Then they were all ordered to move west to Oklahoma. 4 of the tribes left, but the Cherokees took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court and won. At least they won the lawsuit. Then the man on the $20 bill stepped in.
And President Jackson essentially told the Supreme Court, you made your ruling in favor of the Cherokees, now, try to enforce it.
As president, Andrew Jackson controlled the Army, so 14,000 Cherokees and 1,600 slaves were herded to Oklahoma, some groups in winter, with about a quarter of the Indians and blacks dying along the way.
You got plenty of Indians right today don't like Andrew Jackson in this area.
84-year-old Luther Scales, who describes himself as 1/4 black and 3/4 Indian, is president of the Coweta, Oklahoma Historical Society. He remembers stories his Creek Indian grandfather told him about the removal, which was devastating for the Creeks as well.
He said the roughest part of it was crossing the Mississippi River in a boat.
How so?
Well, man, the Mississippi River, do you know down there in Arkansas and Mississippi, when you're talking about a mile or so across the river. And then in a boat, as swift as that water's running, well, you got problems.
Once in Oklahoma, the slaves were put to work, raising cotton, building the new nations. The Merle home, which still stands outside Tahlequah, Oklahoma, was built by the Cherokees' black slaves. And should you think the Indians were much kinder masters than the whites, listen to Granny Phyllis's words in the interview about my great-grandfather.
My husband was George Pettit. He told me his mammy was sold away from him when he was a little boy. He looked down a long lane after her just as long as he could see her and cried after her. He went down to the big road and sat down by his mammy's barefoot tracks in the sand and sat there until it got dark, and then he come on back to the quarters.
Oklahomans reenacting the Civil War Battle of Honey Springs. When it actually occurred, this was the Creek Nation in Indian Territory, slave territory, in which all of the 5 civilized tribes had signed treaties supporting the South. And the battle actually looked much like something out of the movie Glory, except it wasn't the 54th Massachusetts, but the 1st Kansas Colored Regiment that saved the day. Words of her brother, Johnson Thompson, read by his great-grandson, Maurice Shepard.
Pappy wanted to go back to his mother when the war was over and the slaves were freed. He made a deal with Dave Mounts, a white man who was moving into the Indian country, to drive for him.
Granny Phyllis described a harrowing trip in which they had to fight off wolves with fire from their camp, a wagon journey over land and water that lasted 5 weeks.
When we would come to a river, we would cross ferry boats, but me and brother rode on a bed in the back of the wagon, and when we were crossing a river, Father would make us lie down and wouldn't let us look out. He was afraid we would fall out in the river.
Finally, they arrived back to Fort Gibson in northeastern Oklahoma, where their father's mother was working as a cook for the U.S. soldiers.
My grandma, Phyllis Harnage, was the mother of the Colored Baptist Church on 4 Mile Branch, east of Fort Gibson. She organized the church and was head of it as long as she lived.
Since the Cherokee tribe owned all the land, as new Cherokee citizens, the family merely picked a spot. After Granny Phyllis Pettit married, her first child was my grandmother, Lutetia, whose third child was my dad, Sammy. Pettits and Fords still own this land today. Our Black History Special will continue in just a moment with more about black slaves, Red Masters.